Sign this and 40 acres are yours. But I'd be committing malpractice if I didn't tell you. The last person who owned it died with her back against that door. You open your mailbox expecting past due notices. Instead, you find a heavy, wax-sealed envelope telling you that you are the sole heir to a 40-acre property left by a woman whose name you have never heard in your life. Would you walk away? Or would you sign the papers? Terrence Pryor signed. 28 years old. A truck full of tools and nowhere to put them. $214 in the bank. And that signature unlocked a living nightmare. A dead machine shop, a sealed room under the floor, and a set of chains bolted into the bedrock that were never meant to be found. This is the story of a man who inherited 40 acres of rust and everything under it. If you like stories like this one, take a second and subscribe before we start. The first thing to know about Terrence Pryor is that he could hear a machine die 3 weeks before it happened. At the cold storage warehouse in Chelsea, supervisors called him over whenever a conveyor made a noise nobody could name. Terrence would put a screwdriver tip against the housing, press the handle to the bone behind his ear, and go still.
10 seconds.
15. Then, outboard bearing, maybe 40 hours left in it. And 40 hours later, the line went down exactly as he said. He was 28. He had hands that could feel 1/1000th of an inch, and $214 in his checking account. Terrence lived in a one-room walk-up in South Boston. Days he ran mobile repair, forklifts, compressors, dock levelers, roll-up doors, anything with a motor and a grudge. Nights, he pulled an inverter welder out of a Silverado with 240,000 miles on it and fabbed truck racks behind a laundromat by the light of a clamp lamp. To open a shop of his own, he needed a building, 3-phase power, and $60,000 in iron. He'd been fixing other men's buildings since 19. Every one of them owned the roof, the floor, and the machines. Terrence owned the tools in the back of a truck. His parents died on I-71 outside Columbus when he was 14. One truck, one patch of black ice. After that, it was the Ohio foster system. 4 placements in 5 years, and a lesson he learned so early it stopped feeling like a lesson. Nothing is free. If somebody hands you something for nothing, you're not the one being given a gift. You're the thing being used. Remember that. It matters later. The envelope came on a Tuesday in October, wedged between a credit card offer and a shut-off notice from the gas company. It was heavy, cream-colored linen paper, thick as a business card, and on the back a disc of dark red wax. The return address read, Harold Prentice, Attorney at Law, Brattleboro, Vermont. He didn't know anybody in Vermont. He didn't know anybody who owned a wax seal. He had it halfway to the recycling bin. Then he thought about the gas notice in his other hand and stopped. Inside was a single sheet requesting his presence at the Prentice Law Office to discuss the estate of the late Vera Kessler. Terrence read the name 3 times. He had never heard it in his life. Not from his father, not from a caseworker, not from anyone. He stood in that stairwell feeling the dizziness of a door opening in a wall where there had never been one. Messages. Harold Prentice's office smelled like old paper and furniture polish. Walnut paneling, a green banker's lamp, leather spines nobody had opened since the Ford administration. Prentice was past 60, silver-haired. With reading glasses he looked over rather than through. When Terrence sat down, he studied him a moment longer than was polite. 1 part pity, 2 parts curiosity. He opened a folder and squared it against the blotter. Vera Kessler died 3 weeks ago at 88, the last owner of Kessler Machine and Fabrication, 40 acres and a 22,000-square-foot shop in Corbin Hollow. Her will leaves the land, the building, the equipment, and the accounts entirely to you. Terrence laughed. It came out sharp and wrong, more like a cough. Sir, you've got the wrong Pryor. I've never been to Vermont. Prentice slid the folder across the desk without any hurry. Your social security number, your address on West Broadway, and your grandmother's name. Terrence looked down. There it was on the second line, in a document notarized 11 months before he'd ever heard of Vera Kessler. Loretta Vance. His grandmother had died 4 years before he was born. His father had said maybe 6 sentences about her, every one in the past tense and in a hurry. How did she know that name? She's known it since 1974. My firm has been tracking your grandmother's line for the better part of 50 years, on retainer, because Vera Kessler paid us to. The lawyer took his glasses off and set them down. I asked her why. She never told me. There was a stipulation, of course. There is always a stipulation. Prentice read it off the page rather than from memory, which told Terrence he'd found it strange enough to check twice. 1. You must reside on the property for 30 consecutive days. Leave the parcel for more than 24 hours inside that window, and the estate defaults in its entirety to the Vermont Industrial Heritage Trust. 2. And in 31 years I've never drafted a clause like it. Before the deed transfers, you must restore bay number 3 to operating condition and complete the job on work order 1147. Prentice slid over a photocopy of a yellowed card, stapled twice, stamped September 14th, 1974. Some kind of measurement, I assume. Frankly, the whole thing reads like, it's not a measurement. Terrence had the card in both hands now, and his voice dropped so low the lawyer leaned in. That's a diameter, and that's a process. Journal, 3 9/16, hard-faced per OK sequence. Sir, that's not a size. That's a repair. And I don't think there's a man alive who still knows how to do it. Prentice made a small note in the margin of his legal pad, as though a box he hadn't expected to check had just been checked. There was a reporting condition, too. A call to the office every evening at 9. 2 missed in a row, and Prentice had to send the state police out. Then he closed the folder. My advice is that you decline. The building's been shut since 2009, the roof is compromised, and there's no cell service in that hollow whatsoever. But Terrence wasn't listening. He was looking at that yellow card, thinking about a lathe he'd never seen, in a bay he'd never stood in, holding a job somebody had walked away from in the middle. Where do I sign? The GPS gave up 11 miles out of Brattleboro. Terrence drove the last stretch off Prentice's hand-drawn map onto a gravel road that climbed into a fold in the hills and stopped pretending to be maintained. The gate was 2 concrete pillars, cracked and lichen-blotched. Bolted across one was an enameled steel sign, chipped at the edges, hanging from a single hinge and turning slowly in the wind. Kessler Machine and Fabrication, East Time 1921. He drove through and the property opened up. Steel. Everywhere, steel. Racks of tube stock rusted the orange-brown of old blood, standing out of the grass like a rib cage. An old Hister forklift by the dock, its mast frozen at half extension like it had been reaching for something when the power went out. And past it, the shop. Long and low and enormous. 3 bays under one roof. Corrugated steel gone dull silver. Tall sash windows filmed over so thick they looked like cataracts. Terrence shut off the truck. The engine ticked and then stopped. And there was nothing at all. No traffic, no city underneath the silence holding it up. Just wind on metal. He let himself in through the man door. Inside, the dark was total and cold, and it smelled like his whole adult life. Oxidized whey oil, coolant gone sour, dust with iron in it. His flashlight found the shapes first. Machines under canvas tarps, 12 or 15 of them, humped and silent in 2 rows like animals asleep through a winter that had lasted 12 years. And then, high above him, the crane rail made a sound. Tick. Terrence froze with the light straight up. The bridge crane hung there, 10 tons of it, parked at the end of its span. Tick. And a moment later, further down, tick. It was the temperature dropping. Steel contracts when it cools, and 180 feet of crane rail contracts unevenly. He knew that. It did not stop the back of his neck from going tight. He was walking back for his duffel when he saw the kid. 19 maybe, canvas jacket 2 sizes too big, fingers hooked through the fence, staring in at the building like it was a lit window on a cold street. "This is private property now." The kid didn't argue. He let go of the fence and started up the road, hands in his pockets like he'd been asked to leave before and expected to be asked again. Halfway up the rise, he looked back. "You shouldn't be standing on this floor." Terrence came around so fast he nearly dropped the light. A man had come out of the welding bay at the back, 70 or so, heavy through the shoulders, gray beard cut close. He wasn't holding a weapon exactly. He was holding a 3-foot pry bar, low, the way a man holds a tool he's used 10,000 times and could use for something else if the evening went that way. "Who are you?" "Walter Sedlak. I ran this shop for Vera. 35 years as foreman, 12 more watching it rot. She never said one word to me about an heir, and I knew her better than her own doctor did." "I'm not family," Terrence said. "I'm the owner." Walt made a sound that started as a laugh and got put down before it finished. "Owner. All right, owner." He set the pry bar against a rack, and when he spoke again, the mockery was gone out of it entirely, which was somehow worse. "Then hear this once, because I won't say it twice. Lock the man door behind you at night, both bolts." Terrence started to ask why. "Vera Kessler didn't die of 88 years, son. She died of listening." And before Terrence could get a question out, the old man had gone off between the stock racks, and the dark took him the way water takes a stone. There was a chalkboard outside the foreman's office, still carrying a production schedule from 2009. Terrence wiped a corner clean and wrote, "Day 01, 30. Then he unrolled a cot behind the frosted glass and lay down inside 22,000 square feet of dead building. The first 3 nights nearly broke him. There was no signal anywhere on the parcel except at the top of the crane ladder 40 feet up. Every night at 9 he climbed it in the dark, called Brattleboro, said, "This is Pryor, day 2, all clear," and climbed down. In between, the building talked. The roof deck popped. The crane rail ticked. All of it explainable. Except the other thing. 2 in the morning on the second night, a low, heavy thud, muffled, with a rhythm to it. Not a bang, more like something settling its weight. He sat up with his heart going, and 40 seconds later it came again. And here is the part he couldn't get comfortable with. It wasn't the roof, or the racks, or the wind. It was coming from underneath him. So on day 3, he stopped exploring and started working, which was the only intelligent thing anybody did in this story. Prentice had told him the power was off. Prentice was a lawyer. Terrence wiped the grime off the meter glass. It was live. The utility had never disconnected the service, and that was strange enough, but the estate statements were stranger. He went through 12 years of them with a pencil, and the number never dropped. An empty building with the main breaker open bills for almost nothing. Vera Kessler's shop had been billing every month for something that was still running. He wrote the figure on the chalkboard under day 03, underlined it, and went to work on the panel, because a mystery you can't measure is just a feeling. The main disconnect was open, which is why the building was dark, and the panel was what you'd expect. 3 blown 200-amp fuses and contactors pitted green with corrosion. He spent 4 hours on it, then stood in front of the disconnect with his hand on the lever and pushed it home. The building came on in stages. Mercury vapor lamps don't wake all at once. 40 feet overhead, the first struck a cold blue point, then a second, then 5, then 20, warming and spreading down the length of the roof, and one bay at a time the shop came out of the dark in front of him. Terrence Pryor stood in the middle of that floor with his head back and did not move for a full minute. A radial arm drill the size of a small car, 2 engine lathes, a vertical mill, a 200-ton hydraulic press squatting at the end of the west bay like something asleep in a cave. And above it all, the crane, throwing a shadow the length of a bowling lane. He'd worked in 20 shops and never owned so much as a bench. Over the next 2 days, he brought the rest back one system at a time. The compressor took a morning. belts gone hard as jerky, oil like syrup. When it caught and the tank began to fill, the sound of air going into a receiver after 12 years was, to a man like Terrence, a genuinely emotional experience. Then he pulled the tarp off the lathe in Bay 3. A 16 by 60 engine lathe, and it was perfect. Ways bright, not a speck of rust. Every exposed surface coated in cosmoline and wrapped by hand, by somebody who knew exactly how long this machine would have to wait. Bolted to the corkboard beside it was the work order, the real one. And in the rack beneath the tailstock, tagged and chalk-marked, was the part itself. A steel shaft the length of his arm, one journal worn a full 16th undersize. It had been sitting in that rack for 47 years. His door at the end of the office corridor was the only locked one in the building. Terrence didn't touch a pry bar. He drilled the lock core out in 90 seconds, because breaking things is for people who don't know how they're made. Inside was the records room. Shelf after shelf of production ledgers, cloth-bound, dated on the spine, back to 1921. It was all in there. Job numbers, customers, material heats, cutting speeds, quoted hours against actual. 2/3 of it in one hand, square, upright, unhurried. Otto Kessler, according to the flyleaf. Vera's father dead since '69. But there was a second hand in the 1974 margins. Smaller, quicker, rounder. Electrical notes, circuit changes, motor draws, a rewire on the mill. Everyone initialed the same way, LV. Terrence sat down on a step stool with the ledger open on his knees. Loretta Vance, his grandmother, not a visitor, not somebody passing through. She'd been on the payroll of this building as an electrician in 1974, at 24, and she had signed off on its wiring in her own hand. A black woman pulling conduit in a Vermont machine shop in 1974. She'd have been the only one in the county, probably the state. The last LV entry was September 14th, 1974, and it wasn't an amperage note. It was 5 words, pressed hard enough to emboss the page underneath. Bay 3 hot. Do not run the crane tonight. Terrence read it 4 times. It didn't get any clearer, and after that date, his grandmother's handwriting simply stopped. On day 5, he greased the crane because a 10-ton bridge nobody's touched in 12 years is a thing you service before you trust it. And it was up there, on his stomach on the walkway, that he found the second thing that didn't fit. Crane rails wear where the crane lives. Every shop parks the bridge in the same place at the end of every shift, for decades. The paint goes, the steel polishes, and grease off the trolley stains the beam below. The Kessler Bridge had that mark. It was 40 feet from where the crane was parked now, because a crane doesn't drift. Somebody drove it there and left it long enough for oil to stain a 100-year-old beam, then moved it back and never used it again. He climbed down, stood under the mark, and pointed his light at the floor. It was the wash bay. The Mercedes came up the gravel on day 8 faster than the road deserved and stopped hard enough to throw stones against the dock. The man who got out was about 43, in a suit that had been measured on him, wearing shoes that lost traction the second they touched an oiled floor. Terrence Pryor, you're better with a wrench than my attorneys said you'd be. The lights are on. Who are you? Preston Brennan. Vera was my aunt. He said it looking past Terrence down the length of the shop, taking inventory. My aunt spent the last 20 years of her life talking to machinery. That's not sentiment, that's a diagnosis. She had no business handing 40 acres to a stranger from South Boston. Then take it to probate. Probate takes 4 years. He set the briefcase on a layout table, thumbed the latches, and turned it around. Cash. Banded hundreds in rows, corner to corner. 250,000. Today. Take the cash, walk away, and forget this shop ever existed. Terrence looked at the money, and what made him hesitate wasn't greed, it was arithmetic. $60,000 was a building lease. $90,000 was a lathe and a mill and a welder that didn't run off a household plug. It was, in one briefcase, the life he'd spent 10 years failing to save toward. And then the voice from 20 years of hard schooling came up behind it. Nothing is free. If a man's handing it to you, you're not the one being given the gift. What do you do for a living, Mr. Brennan? Brennan's smile flickered. Industrial services, Springfield. Rebuild contracts. And how many of those are you losing? Because you can't actually rebuild anything. You just broker replacements out of a catalog. The silence went on too long, and Terrence watched something drop away from the man's face like a curtain coming off a machine. Brennan's eyes moved, past Terrence into the records room where the door was standing open. There's a book in this building. Cloth cover. Green. Otto Kessler's book. He wasn't smiling now. Have you touched it? In a room with $250,000 open on a layout table, Preston Brennan had just asked about a notebook. I don't know what you're talking about. You will. Brennan closed the briefcase and picked it up carelessly, like a jacket. My father walked this fence line every spring for 30 years. He never got past that gate because he wasn't blood on paper, and no court in Vermont cared what he knew. He said it with something close to wonder, and it was the ugliest thing Terrence had seen all week. You got here in 3 days. You keep saying family, Terrence said, but you're not a Kessler. Not one drop. You're whatever came after the man she married. Preston Brennan stopped walking. He didn't turn around, and he didn't answer. And he was in the Mercedes and down the gravel 40 seconds later. On day 10, Terrence tried to do the job. He wasn't being reckless. He had the shaft indicated in the forejaw to under 2 thousandths, the journal cut back clean and square, and he laid the hard facing down himself. His own rod, his own settings, his own hand. And it was beautiful. A good hard-face bead has a look to it, an evenness, and this one had it. He shut the machine off, feeling something he hadn't felt in years, pride in his own building. Then it cooled. He heard it before he saw it, a dry, almost polite tick from the rack. And when he brought the light in close, there it was, a hairline crack running the whole length of the deposit like a thread laid on the metal. 47 years that part had waited. He'd ruined it in an afternoon. You fought the steel. Walt was in the bay door with a thermos, and God knows how long he'd been there. I did everything right. You did everything fast. The old man looked at the crack for 2 seconds and didn't touch it, which was its own verdict. Otto never fought it. Every shop in this valley tried to copy him, and nobody could. He didn't force the metal to behave. He waited it out. Waited how? Preheat? Inner pass? Couldn't tell you the numbers, son. I ran the floor, not the process. Walt screwed the cap back onto his thermos. That's the part he wrote down. Nobody's read it in 50 years. On day 11, Terrence packed. It wasn't dramatic. He rolled the cot, put his bags in the truck bed, and sat in the cab with one boot on the gravel. 19 days left, a ruined part, and no idea what he was standing in the middle of. He put his hand on the key. And inside the dark building, the compressor kicked on. Just the pressure switch doing its job. But the shop filled with that steady, working sound of something breathing. A building he'd brought back from the dead, running by itself, with nobody in it. He carried his bags back inside. He went back into the records room because Walt had said the words, he wrote it down, and Terrence hadn't stopped hearing them. He didn't find the book. What he found was the requisition binders, every bag of sand, every rod, every foot of chain that ever came off the Kessler shelves, signed out against a job number back a century, which is when the shop showed him the third thing that didn't fit. September 14th, 1974. Handwriting he didn't recognize, pressed hard, hurried. 40 concrete block, 1 bag mortar, 12 feet 3/8 chain, charged against JOB 1148. Terrence pulled the production ledger for that year and went looking for what job 1148 had been. 1146 was a bearing housing for a creamery. 1147 was the journal in the rack behind him, held unfinished. And then the ledger went to 1149. There was no 1148. Not entered late, not crossed out, not carried to another page. In a building where every ounce of stock had been logged for 53 years, one number had simply been skipped. And somebody had still drawn material against it. Block, mortar, chain. Terrence sat with that binder on his knees and felt the shape of something moving under this whole property, under the ledgers, under the crane mark, under the floor. 40 concrete block will build a wall 8 feet wide and 4 feet high. He didn't sleep much that night. After that, he stopped waiting for the building to tell him things and started interrogating it, the way you go at a machine you can't fix. Stop guessing, start measuring. He clamped a meter on every circuit in the panel and built a load map. 31 circuits, 30 accounted for, and one that wasn't. It was labeled in faded grease pencil, PITLTS. Terrence pulled the original panel schedule, dated 1971 and drawn in his grandmother's hand, and went through it 3 times. There was no pit lighting circuit. On the drawing, that breaker position was blank. He clamped the meter on it anyway. 1.8 amps. There it was, the money on the electric bill, in the flesh. Something on the far end of that wire had been drawing power the whole time, through 12 years of an empty building. So he stood in the wash bay, under the grease shadow, and looked down. The shop had 4 inspection pits, every one covered by a diamond plate lid on a bolted frame. 16 bolts, hex head. Except this one. That lid was welded, continuous bead all 4 sides laid from above, and the apron around it patched with a concrete whose aggregate didn't match a square foot of the rest of that floor. Somebody had nailed that floor shut from the outside and hadn't planned on opening it again. But Terrence didn't cut it open. Not yet. The crane had told him where. The requisition had told him what. What he still didn't have was the thing Walt said had been written down and never read. So he went back to the lathe. The 4th thing was 6 inches. He'd gone back to the machine drawings for a bearing spec when his eye caught the assembly sheet for the lathe in Bay 3. Chip pan depth, called out plainly, 11 inches. He'd found a caliper in that machine's tool drawer on day 1, an old Starrett, worn silver at the thumb wheel, 2 letters scratched into the frame by somebody who wanted her tools back. LV. He measured the chip pan with his grandmother's caliper, 5 inches. It took 11 minutes with a pipe wrench and a punch to get the pan out. Underneath it, in a compartment fabricated into the base casting, wrapped in oilcloth and desiccant paper, was a notebook. Green cloth cover, 90-odd pages, Otto Kessler's square, upright hand. And on the first page, a machine can be replaced. The knowledge is the shop. Here is what Terrence expected. A manual. Otto Kessler had not written that notebook for anybody. He wrote it for himself, in the shorthand of a man who already knew what he meant. And 50 years on it read like code, because that is what it was. Temperatures weren't in degrees, they were in colors. Bring to cherry, hold, fall to straw. He could work with that. Every blacksmith who ever lived worked with that. The flux was the problem. 2 of the gray. 1 of Dutchman's. Half of the red. No product names, no suppliers. 3 shop nicknames for 3 materials that came off a shelf in this building in 1948 and hadn't been on any shelf since. And under the cooling schedule, in the same untroubled hand, pack the box, 9 hours, don't open it early. There was no box, no drawing of a box, no box anywhere in 22,000 square feet because he looked. Twice. He sat with that notebook for 2 days and got nowhere, and it was the most useful failure of his adult life. This wasn't a recipe. It was the working memory of a dead man, and the only thing on earth that could translate it was the room full of ledgers down the hall. So he went back into the records room and read 100 years of purchase invoices. It took 4 nights. He found the gray in a 1951 statement from an alloy house in Providence, a ferromanganese powder sold by the keg, tagged in Otto's own margin note as gray. He found Dutchman's in a 1938 invoice from a Springfield supplier run by a family named Duivendak, which the whole shop had given up pronouncing by about 1925. And the red was iron oxide, ground fine, 40 pounds at a time from a foundry in Troy. 3 names, in 3 decades, in 3 men's handwriting. Nobody else on earth could have decoded that notebook because nobody else had the ledgers. And that was the whole point. Otto Kessler never patented this. A patent is a public document, and a public document is a recipe you hand your competitors. So he split it in half. The process in a book hidden inside a machine, and the key to the book on an open shelf, in a room where it looked like nothing but bookkeeping. The box he had to build himself. There was no drawing, but there was a dimension. 1 line in a 1946 ledger margin, charging out sheet steel and 100 pounds of lime against shop overhead. Soaking chest, 14 by 14 by 48. Terrence built it in a day and a half. 16-gauge sheet, angle iron frame, double wall, packed with lime and vermiculite, lid on 2 hinges he cut and bent himself. It was the first thing he ever made in that building. It was ugly. It worked. Mary. And then he ignored it. Not the box, the alloy. The gray was a specialty order, 4 to 6 weeks out, and Terrence had 14 days on the clock. So he did what every competent man does when he's certain he understands the problem better than the paperwork. He substituted. He had a modern hard-facing wire in the truck. Higher hardness, tighter spec, a metallurgy sheet Otto Kessler would have wept over. He ran a test coupon out of scrap from the same heat. Preheat by color. Box, packed, 9 hours, exactly as written. At dawn, the deposit came out flawless, bright, hard, no crack anywhere. Then he put it in the vise, took a 2-pound hammer, and rang it the way you're supposed to. The face came off in a sheet. Not a crack, a separation. The whole deposit had let go of the steel underneath in one clean plate, like ice off a windshield. And that was the morning he understood what he'd been given. Otto's alloy wasn't better than the modern wire. It was softer. Deliberately, stubbornly softer. Because a hard face on an old shaft won't move when the shaft moves, and every machine that turns hot, and everything that gets hot grows. Modern wire wins the hardness test and loses the shaft. Otto Kessler hadn't built it hard. He'd built it patient. Terrence ordered the gray that afternoon and paid for freight he could not afford. And it was the best money he ever spent. Because for the first time in his life, somebody had taught him something he could not have worked out on his own. It took most of a day to open the floor. He cut the weld with a plasma torch, ran 2 lifting eyes into the lid, and brought the crane down the rail to take it, back over the wash bay, onto the mark where it had sat 47 years ago. 900 pounds of diamond plate came up an inch at a time. He swung it clear, set it on timbers, and stood at the edge with the light. It wasn't an inspection pit. There was a steel plate corridor down there, framed and welded, running 20 feet north under the shop floor. At the end of it, a door, half-inch plate, skimmed with parged concrete so anybody who got that lid up would look down and see a foundation wall. Terrence went down and stood in front of it. It had been fabricated in this building. He could see it in the corner welds, in the way the hinge leaves were let into the frame. Somebody built it upstairs on a layout table he'd been eating lunch off for 2 weeks. The latch was on his side. He worked it, the door came open on hinges that hadn't moved since Nixon, and the cold came out at him. And there was light in there. A single bulb in a cage, 60 watts, burning over the middle of the room. 1.8 amps. 47 years. The vault was 30 feet by 20, cut into bedrock. The far end was sealed off with concrete block. 40 of them. Against the near wall, Canvas duffels rotted through at the seams, spilling $100 bills that had fused solid underground into blocks you could throw through a window. Behind them, on a pallet, silver and gold bullion, some bars still stamped by a depot, others melted down and recast in a shape that matched nothing any mint ever made. Re-poured in Otto Kessler's own furnace upstairs in this building. On a workbench, a box file of invoices on Kessler letterhead. Jobs that were never quoted for customers that never existed. Somebody had run money through this shop the way you run water through a filter. And then Terrence turned his light to the corner. There was a man down there, what was left of one, seated with his back against the rock and his head tipped forward. A polyester suit, wide lapels, the fabric gone to lace. One wrist still inside a manacle, and the manacle on 3/8 chain, shackled to a lifting eye set 8 inches into the bedrock. 12 feet of it. Signed out on the 14th of September, 1974. Beside the body, on an overturned crate, was a kerosene lantern burned down to nothing, and a card, yellowed, double-stapled, stamped September 14th, 1974. The other work order 1147, the one that was never filed. He turned it over. On the back, in a hand that was not Otto's, someone had written a shop entry in the only language she had left. Job 1147. Journal 3 9/16, hard face. Status, held. Job 1148. 1 man, 9 hours, 40 block, mortar, 1 length of 3/8 chain. He used my father's furnace to melt other people's lives. I gave him back to the floor. 2 of us did. God forgive us both. You already know most of it. Terrence came around with the light. Walt Sedlak stood in the vault doorway with a double-barreled shotgun held low, both muzzles at the floor. And he wasn't looking at Terrence at all. He was looking at the corner. I was 23, apprentice, 2nd year. I came in at 6 on the 15th, and there was fresh mortar on a wall that hadn't been there the day before. He shifted the gun to his other hand. And the crane was 40 feet off its mark. You knew. He broke a ribs twice that I know of and once that I saw. Walt said it flat, the way you read a number off a gauge. I told the county he'd run to Canada. In 35 years, I never once asked her what was behind that wall. You loved her. I fixed her machines, son. Same thing where I come from. The rest came later, out of the invoice file and 4 months of forensics. Vera Kessler married Dale Brennan in 1971. He was charming, he was violent, and he understood exactly what he'd married into. A private plant 40 acres from the nearest neighbor, with a furnace and a reason to move steel at any hour. In September of 1974, he and 2 associates took an armored transfer outside Bellows Falls for $3 million. The associates were never found. On the night of the 14th, drunk and done pretending, he told his wife he was leaving for Canada in the morning, and that before he went he'd tie off both loose ends. His wife, and the shop electrician who'd seen too much of what came off those trucks. Loretta Vance, 24 years old, 4 months pregnant. Vera ground up her father's heart medication and stirred it into his whiskey. Loretta killed the feed to Bay 3 so nobody on the county road would see a lit shop at 2 in the morning. They used the crane anyway, dark and slow. Then Loretta ran. Ohio, a different name, a son born the following spring who grew up knowing nothing. And Vera stayed. 50 years in the same building over the same floor. Then the old man's head came up and the softness went out of his face. How many calls have you missed? Terrence looked at his watch. 11:40 at night. 1. Then he knows you're in a hole in the ground. And above them came a sound Terrence recognized instantly. The high, tearing whine of a cut-off wheel going into the lock of a roll-up door. Mem. Here is what Preston Brennan never understood about the building he'd spent his life trying to get into. He'd only ever seen it lit. He came up the wash bay ladder past the parts crib and got his hand on the lighting panel 11 seconds before the door came off its lock and slammed up its track. He killed the lights. Not the main disconnect, he needed the power. Just the 6 lighting breakers, one sweep of his hand. 22,000 square feet went black. And here's the thing about mercury vapor lamps. Once they go out, they won't restart. Not for 10 minutes, no matter what you do to the switch, because the arc tube has to cool before it'll strike again. The only light left was the emergency lamps over the 2 doors. 2 pools of white 140 feet apart. Enough to work by if you knew where everything was. "Pryor!" Brennan's voice came bouncing off the roof deck, and behind it a second set of footsteps, heavier and unhurried. Terrence pressed his back into the parts crib and listened. And listening was the one thing he was better at than anybody. Dress shoes on an oiled floor, a fast step, a scuff, a correction. Brennan was up the center aisle, slipping every 4th stride. The other man wore work boots, wasn't slipping at all, and was going wide along the east wall to flank. 2 pins on a board, and Terrence had the whole board in his head. He went up the ladder to the crane cab on the far side of the crib, moving when they moved and stopping when they stopped. 9 seconds. He hit the contactor and picked the load that was already slung, 2 tons of steel tube that had hung there since 2009. Then he ran the bridge south and let it swing. 2 tons of steel came out of the dark at chest height across the width of the shop. It didn't hit anybody, and it wasn't meant to. It went through a rack of bar stock like a wrecking ball through a fence, and the noise of 40 feet of racking coming down in a pitch-black building will unmake a man's nerve. The one in the boots went down under the second rack as it folded, pinned at the hip, his pistol skating away into a coolant trench. And that left Preston Brennan. Terrence heard him brake for the north roll-up where the emergency light was. Dress shoes flat out down an aisle Terrence had walked 8 times that week. Straight through Bay 2, past the wash bay, where a 900-pound lid sat on timbers and the pit it belonged to stood wide open in the dark. The flashlight in Brennan's hand was up, chest height, sweeping the racks, looking for a man. It is a hard thing to teach, and every apprentice learns it the same way. On a shop floor, you don't look ahead. You look down. There was a sound like a boot going through rotten stair tread, hollow steel and empty air. Then silence for the length of a held breath. Then a scream came up out of 12 feet of concrete and rock. Terrence took a hand lamp off the crib and walked to the edge. Preston Brennan lay on the steel decking at the bottom with both legs broken in ways legs are not supposed to break, screaming and threatening at once, all of it running together. And 30 feet up the rail, still slung, 2 tons of steel tube hung directly over that opening. The crane pendant was still clipped to Terrence's belt. 1 button. Do it. Brennan's voice came up out of the hole, ragged. Do it, or I swear to God I'll spend every dollar I have burying you in a courtroom for the rest of your life. Terrence stood at the edge of that pit with his thumb resting on a button. And then he thought about a 24-year-old electrician who ran a crane in the dark in this building one night in 1974, ran from it for the rest of her life, and never told her own son what she'd done. He pressed the up arrow. The hoist took the load 20 feet higher, and he ran the bridge north until it hung over empty floor and set the brake. My grandmother wired this building, he said down into the hole. She's not going to have to watch it eat another man. Then he climbed the crane ladder 40 feet in the dark to the one place on the property with a signal and called the state police. They were already coming. He'd missed a second 9 o'clock call, and a lawyer in Brattleboro had done exactly what the document told him to do. Mem. Walt Sedlak took a round through the shoulder and never mentioned it until a paramedic found the blood. He was complaining about the hospital food inside of 2 days. The man in the boots gave up his employer before the second cruiser arrived. Preston Brennan came out of that pit in a basket stretcher and was charged with attempted murder, conspiracy, and breaking and entering. The remains were identified through dental records as Dale Brennan, missing since September of 1974, and a robbery cold for 47 years closed with a 2-paragraph press release. The money and the bullion went into evidence, all of it. The insurer had dissolved in 1996. The statute had run, and both women who might have been charged were past the reach of any court. As the legal heir and the man who reported it, Terrence Pryor was paid a finder's fee of $280,000. Enough to change his year. Not enough to change his life. $3 million had sat under that floor for 47 years and bought exactly one thing: a hole in the bedrock with a man chained inside it. Every dollar was evidence, and every dollar was somebody else's. The thing actually worth something was 90 pages of shorthand in a green cloth cover, and it was worth something for one reason only. Terrence Pryor was now the only person alive who could read it. On day 30, he ran the job. He mixed the flux by Otto's ratios in a coffee can, brought the shaft up by color instead of by pyrometer, laid the deposit in 4 passes with his hand moving slower than it wanted to, and packed it into a chest he'd built himself. 9 hours. Checked every 40 minutes through the night. It came out at dawn, cold, with no crack in it. He ground it, polished it, and mic'd it, 2/10 under the print. Then he took a 2-pound hammer and rang it hard 3 times. Nothing moved. Harold Prentice drove out that afternoon with the deed on the seat beside. He stood in the middle of a lit shop floor in his good shoes, listened to the lathe in Bay 3 running a finish cut, and said nothing for a while, which Terrence appreciated. "May I ask you something, Mr. Pryor? Why would a woman who wanted this found make it so difficult to find?" Terrence shut the machine down and wiped his hands. "You're the one who drafted it." Prentice looked up at the crane, then at the floor, and Terrence watched a 30-year-old question come apart in front of him. A will is a public document. There it is. If she'd written down what was under this floor, the wrong man would have read it inside a week. So she didn't write it down at all. She wrote down a repair. Prentice took his glasses off and held them. And then she waited for somebody who could do it. He wasn't left a fortune. He was left an entrance exam. Here is why any of this mattered. There are short-line railroads all over New England running locomotives built before the Second World War. Paper mills in Maine turning press rolls cast in 1938. Hydro plants in the Berkshires with turbine shafts nobody has made since Eisenhower. When one of those shafts goes undersize, the owner gets 2 answers. Cast a new one. $90,000, 2-year lead, if a foundry will even quote a run of 1. Or scrap the machine. The third answer sat inside a lathe in Corbin Hollow from 1969 until Terrence Pryor pulled a chip pan. Terrence could rebuild that journal in 9 days for $11,000. And nobody could undercut him because nobody could copy him. The process was never patented and never published. The alloy was a house mix keyed to 3 nicknames buried in 3 decades of invoices. The jigs were 1 of 1. And there was one more thing, which he didn't understand until an insurance adjuster asked for it. Nobody puts an unrated repair under a locomotive. A railroad needs documentation, proof the process has done this before and held. And in a room off the office corridor sat 101 years of production ledgers. Every job, every heat, every hour, in 3 generations of handwriting. The archive wasn't the record of the business. The archive was the business. His first call went to Pemi Valley Scenic Railroad, whose owner's great-grandfather had sent a shaft to this shop in 1974 and never gotten it back. "I'm calling about a job my shop took in September of '74. It's finished." I apologize for the delay. The line was quiet long enough that he checked the phone. My father used to say, if it turned, Kessler could save it. The man cleared his throat. I assumed that number was dead. They had a 1926 Baldwin sitting cold in a barn with a driving axle no foundry would quote. Terrence did it in 9 days. It is still under that locomotive, and that locomotive still runs. 3 more calls came that month, 11 the next. By spring, he had a 14-month backlog and a standing contract with a mill in Berlin, New Hampshire, turning work away, Not for lack of machines, but because one set of hands in the building knew the sequence. The kid came back in April, same canvas jacket, hands hooked in the wire, watching the crane move. "You want to come in or keep doing that?" His name was Casey Renfro, 19, climbing that fence since he was 11, and his hands shook when Terrence opened the gate. Terrence didn't let him touch the lathe for a month. What he handed him that first morning was a push broom and a blank notebook. Everything this building teaches you, you write down. Every setup, every number that worked, every one that didn't. He tapped the cover twice. "A machine you can always buy again. This is the shop. That's the only rule that's ever mattered in here." By August, the kid could pack a soaking chest without being told. By November, he could call the color on a preheat within 20 degrees, which had taken Terrence 3 months and 2 ruined coupons. And on a Tuesday the following spring, Terrence stood at the end of Bay 3 with his arms folded and watched a 19-year-old from Corbin Hollow lay down a Kessler hard face on a live customer job. 4 passes, slow, patient, the way a dead man wrote it in 1948. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The sign went back up that summer, sandblasted and repainted by hand. Kessler Machine and Fabrication, Eastertay 1921, Pryor and Company. Terrence Pryor drove into Corbin Hollow with a truck full of tools and nowhere to set them down. He'd spent his whole adult life fixing buildings that belonged to other men. Nobody gave him this one. What he was handed was a locked building, a dead trade, a man welded under the floor, and a test with a 30-day clock on it. And he passed it with a meter, a caliper, 4 nights of invoices, and 2 ruined coupons that taught him the only thing he didn't already know. The money was evidence. The land was dirt. The inheritance was 90 pages of code that one man on earth could read, and he became that man by hand, on purpose, in 30 days. He didn't find a home in Corbin Hollow. He built one, and then he made sure somebody else could build one too. So what about you? Would you have taken the $250,000 and driven back to Boston? Or would you have cut open that floor? Tell me in the comments. Like, share, and subscribe for more real-life mysteries.